stuck here. The cops won't bother me. So I wanted to talk to you guys about, maybe I wanted to compare the vstrom 650 to this nc700. I know that they're very different bikes, but they're very similar in many ways, and I think the similarities are more like the riders that get vstroms are the same riders that would possibly get an nc700. I know because I'm one of those riders. So I've had many bikes, and I don't really consider, like, when you buy a Ninja 250 a downgrade. You know, I went from an ST 1300 to a Ninja 250, and I was fine, you know, like, and people would go like, oh, what the hell are you doing? You're downgrading, you know? Yeah, both bikes are great bikes. You know, you can't go wrong with the vstrom or the nc700, but the V-twin of that vstrom is just so much nicer to ride. It's not as fuel efficient as this one. You know, this one gets 70 miles to the gallon. That's Ninja 250 territory. That's incredible. That's why this thing is a great commuter. One of the things I really like about this NC as opposed to the vstrom is that this thing, you can pretty much maintain it all by yourself. You don't have to depend on motorcycle shops. The valves on this are so easy to adjust because they just use a lock and nut to adjust. But also on the vstrom, you have to realize that those engines and those valves do not go out of adjustment very quickly. I mean, there's guys that have 100,000 miles on vstrom 650s without adjusting the valves because, I don't know, I guess it just keeps, you know, it's just a very stable system. So for me, having a really good motor is important. But both of these bikes are very reliable. You know, this one is a little bit different because it's not as proven as the vstrom. When you look at the vstrom's engine was in the SV650. It's been tested. This bike, on the other hand, does feel like a budget bike. It feels like it's just a little bit too flimsy. Like I've talked about the build quality. The build quality of Honda has been going down lately. I don't really know why, but it feels like they skipped out on several things. Honda does this a lot. You know, they build like gimmicky sort of stuff. So this bike does feel like it's got a couple of gimmicks. You know, the front trunk, the gas tank in the back. You know, they feel like gimmicks, very smart gimmicks, and I think very useful gimmicks. For me, that's one of the really important things about this bike, is that engine and the front trunk and everything. Another interesting thing comparing the vstrom 650 to the NC is that the vstrom has got a 19-inch front wheel, and you might think, well, what's the big deal? It's just a little bit bigger. But that 19-inch front wheel makes it so much better to ride off-road. It really does. And you would not think, oh, it's no big deal, but you know, I've ridden the vstrom cross country, and I did a lot of the TAT, the Trans-America Trail, and I don't know how I would feel about taking this bike off-road, because that front wheel is so much more stable when you're riding off-road. Like on the road, I think the steering is a little bit different on the vstrom, probably a little bit slower than this one. But also the vstrom, most roads around here, there's really no roads that's like super tight, but there are roads that are more sweepers. And in most countries that I've been to, you know, unless you're going to go to Europe, most of the roads feel like that. Like it feels like a little bit higher speed bike like the vstrom would be a better deal. Comfort wise, the vstrom definitely is more comfortable. I can tell right away. And I had the stock seat as well, and the vstrom felt much better because the seat on the vstrom was so much wider. Even for a passenger, the vstrom was so much better because it gave you like a big wide seat. This bike, it's very narrow. It feels like almost like a dirt bike seat, which is confusing because the 19-inch front wheel of the vstrom is so much better. So I don't understand Honda's reasoning, because if you're going to make a bike that's good for commuting, you should make it comfortable because you're going to be spending a lot of time on the seat. But it's not the case in this bike. They decided to make it narrow like a dirt bike, but less capable off-road. As far as miles per gallon, I've told you guys, this bike gets much better gas mileage than the vstrom. The vstrom is no slouch. It gets like 50 to 55 miles to the gallon. And this one, it's estimated like 65, 70. But I've heard of riders getting like 90. So this thing gets scooter-like miles per gallon. And almost like, it's more like Ninja 250 miles per gallon. And then scooter-like miles per gallon if you want to be tame with the throttle. So commuting wise, this makes a much better bike. Now for commuting, I believe that the nc700 is a much better commuter than the vstrom, just because it's much more narrow, and if you live in a city and you need to kind of maneuver around, this thing is so much better because it's like, it's narrow. It feels like you can throw it around a little bit easier than the vstrom. It's got less plastic to deal with than the vstrom. And it feels like you are much better at filtering with this thing. But when it comes to comfort, of course the vstrom has got an edge to this one. Suspension wise, the vstrom is a little bit better. It's also got adjustability in the rear suspension on the fly, and this one does not. It doesn't have anything. The wind protection on this is also a lot worse. So if you're commuting in the winter, you're gonna probably wish you got a vstrom. But in the summertime, when most riders are gonna be riding, they're gonna choose this bike because, you know, you get a nice wind and breeze, and of course in the winter that's gonna be your enemy. When it comes to resale value, this nc700 is currently more expensive than the older generation of the vstrom, but the vstrom has got a cult-like following. The riders that get the vstroms tend to hold on to them for a very long time. This NC, it seems like the riders that get this are new riders or back at the game of riding from a very long hiatus of not riding. So, and almost it feels like nc700 riders are, this bike is much more popular, I believe, in Europe than in the United States. When it comes to touring, the vstrom hands down much better than this bike. It's got a bigger range, and it's also much more stable on the highway. It feels like a more substantial bike. This bike kind of gets blown around on the highway, even though it's the same, almost the same weight. And I think it's because the weight is a little bit further down the road, or down the engine. You know, the center of the gravity is a little bit lower. So it feels like it gets blown around just a little bit more, which I can't understand. And of course, on the highway, having a little bit more horsepower is kind of important. And this one makes about 15 to 20 horsepower less than the vstrom. So if you're a horsepower freak, and in a way I kind of feel like I am a little bit of a freak when it comes to horsepower, I do like the vstrom a little bit better for the highway because, you know, you can twist the throttle and it'll take you there. Yeah, this bike does not feel as good over rough terrain as the vstrom, and I think that has a lot more to do with the 19-inch front wheel and the better suspension. This thing just feels very unstable and even the brakes are not as good as the vstroms. You know, there's nothing like having two discs up front. I mean, it has some power, it does move, it just doesn't feel like a bike that has that V-twin action. You see, like the railroad tracks, if you look at my arms, when I hit one of these things, it sends you quite a big shock throughout your body. And I might be a little bit critical of this bike because I really thought that the vstrom was almost perfect. The vstrom 650, the only issue I had is that I wish that it had a shaft drive. Otherwise, it was as close as you could get to like a perfect motorcycle to work on. Kind of offsets a lot of the bad things, you know, reaching the engine up in the front, being able to remove the forks with just 2 bolts per fork leg is incredibly good. The reach to the battery is easy. I'm sure there's like other stuff that I haven't really looked at, but this bike seems to be really good for working on, and it's something that not a lot of makers like to do in motorcycles these days. Also, one of the beauties of the NC is that most riders are able to use all of the NC. It's just like you can pretty much give it full gas all the time, and that's normal riding. It revs low, you know, it's just very easy to ride, and you don't have to worry about like keeping the bike in control, because it's a very good bike for riding in most general conditions. Another really great thing about the NC over the vstrom is that the NC feels so much lighter than the vstrom, and I think that has a lot to do with the weight just being lower. You know, on paper, when you look at the stats of this bike, it just looks like a very slow bike, but it doesn't really feel super slow. And the weight is just so much further down that it makes it a much easier bike to ride every day. You know, if you're going to ride every day, this thing, you can just toss it around quite a bit and not have any big issues with it. It just feels like a much nimbler bike than what it is. Yeah, when it comes to bikes, what you guys need to do is buy Japanese, because they treat you a whole lot better in the long run. Oh, by the way, this bike is just so easy to kind of maneuver and go and do like U-turns like this. Look at that, it's just so easy. All right, squids, thanks for watching. Remember, even though I'm critical doesn't mean I hate the bikes. I just think some bikes are better than others for different people. No big deal. All right, squids, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Kind of stuck here. The cops won't bother me.